Hey friends, before we ease into this first sleepy story, take a moment to gently tap that like button, maybe even subscribe if you haven't already. It helps the channel flow as smoothly as a Roman aqueduct. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Is it the start of your wind down or the final stretch before dreamland? Now, let's begin. You are in Rome. Not the modern, traffic-snarled Rome of today, but the Rome of the 2nd century CE, when marble still gleamed, when senators wore togas in earnest, and when public bathing was not just a pastime, but a civic ritual. Senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, wealthy, ambitious, and mildly nearsighted, enters his private bath complex, located just off the Esquiline Hill. It is early afternoon, the time when most of the city's upper crust takes refuge from the Mediterranean sun in a cloud of warm, soapy vapor. But unlike the average Roman citizen who crowds into the Thermae with hundreds of others, Piso owns his own bathhouse, complete with tiled caldarium, vaulted tepidarium, and a personal slave trained to operate the complicated hypercost heating system beneath the floors. It's a marvel of engineering, and occasionally, a bit of a maze. The labyrinth of cleanliness. Roman bathhouses were not designed for directness. They were sprawling, multi-room facilities with hot rooms, cold plunges, steam closets, oiling benches, and sometimes libraries, shrines, or garden courtyards. Even smaller private versions, like Piso's, could feature more than a dozen rooms connected by corridors lined with mosaics of dolphins, Neptune, and other water-appropriate motifs. In Piso's case, the layout included a separate entrance for guests, a narrow changing room, apoditerium, and 2 exits that curved away in different directions. One led to the frigidarium, the gold bath, the other to the caldarium, the hot room with heated marble slabs and shallow basins for sweating and soaking. Piso had used this bath complex dozens of times before, but today, perhaps slightly distracted after a long morning in the Senate, he misplaces his sandal and steps out the wrong door. What follows is not a disaster, but a quietly confusing episode in architectural humility. How did Roman baths actually work? To understand how Piso could get lost in his own luxury, you have to understand how Roman baths functioned. Each bathhouse relied on an intricate underfloor heating system called a hypercost. A furnace, stoked by slaves, pumped hot air through a suspended floor built on stone pillars. The air traveled up flues embedded in the walls, heating them evenly. Some rooms were kept at sauna-like temperatures. Others offered a milder warmth or a bracing. The exit of a Roman bathhouse was rarely direct. Many complexes were laid out in loops or spirals. Some forced bathers to walk back through warming rooms to avoid temperature shock. Others guided them toward gardens or libraries, or even small shrines for post-bath reflection. The point wasn't speed, it was pacing. And so Piso, already bathed, fed, and dressed, finds himself once again in a mosaic-lined hallway that does not quite lead where he thought it would. A marble bust of Minerva stares at him blankly. A servant politely coughs. "Ah," Piso mutters, "again." He doubles back. What do we learn from a man who could conquer provinces but not his plumbing? It would be easy to laugh at a Roman senator who got lost in his own bathhouse, but the truth is more comforting. Even in the heart of empire, even among marble and mosaics and whispered politics, people wandered. People forgot which corridor led where. People left with the wrong sandals. People said too much in the frigidarium. People slipped, slid, paused, and retraced their steps. The bathhouse was a space of ritual and repetition, but also of benign confusion. It was one of the few places in Rome where even the powerful were allowed to relax into a kind of dignified disorientation. Piso wasn't alone in his wandering. He was human in it. So as you close your eyes and picture the last plumes of steam curling above the tiled domes, the quiet ripple of cold water in the marble basin, and a slightly damp senator squinting at yet another wrong turn, you might wonder, did the Romans build their bathhouses not only to cleanse, but to offer a rare and quiet permission to simply not know where you're going? Water was moved through lead pipes, fistulae, and reused in cycles depending on temperature and purpose. Cold baths might be fresh, hot baths less so. Navigating this world meant navigating smells of oil and mildew, sounds, echoes, dripping, murmuring, and temperatures, each offering sensory cues. But these cues weren't always clear in the fog. Piso wanders first into a mop closet, where he encounters a confused slave carrying linen bundles. Then into what he believes is the tepidarium, only to find the pool drained for cleaning. He doubles back, trailing a wet sandal. By the time he reaches the actual hot room, he has made a full loop, collected 2 different towels, and begun muttering about architectural treachery. The servants, of course, say nothing. One offers him perfumed oil. Another gently steers him to a bench. Piso sits, still mildly disoriented, but resigned to the soothing warmth of the stones. Getting lost in Roman baths, private or public, was not uncommon. Accounts from the era mention citizens wandering from one bathhouse into another through shared walls. One satirical poet joked about a man who entered the laconicum, dry sauna, only to emerge 2 hours later with someone else's sandals and no idea what day it was. The scale and complexity of Roman baths made disorientation almost inevitable, especially in larger thermae like Caracalla's or Diocletian's, which could hold thousands of bathers at once. And the opulence of the decoration, frescoes, statuary, echoing domes, didn't help navigation. Every corner looked divine, but none particularly directional. In Roman life, a bath was more than hygiene. It was transition, from stress to ease, from politics to privacy, from city to self. And to lose one's way inside it, that wasn't failure, it was almost expected. Like wandering in a sacred space, a small surrender to the complexity of cleanliness. So as Piso finally settles into his favorite corner, his forehead slick with gentle perspiration, his thoughts adrift between political maneuverings and whether he's due for a trim, you may ask, in a city built on order and law, did the bathhouse offer the only place where a senator could safely get lost on purpose? The caldarium is humming. Not loudly, of course. Just the steady hum of a chamber at the perfect temperature, stone walls exhaling heat, water sloshing in wide shallow basins, and the occasional grunt from a bather lowering himself into the tub a little too fast. Senator Piso, now thoroughly reoriented, reclines on a low bench with a towel draped over one shoulder and a small pile of olive oil vessels beside him. His sandals have been retrieved, his dignity mostly restored. But he's not in a rush. Because Roman baths weren't just for washing. They were for lingering. And as Piso begins the next phase of his routine, scraping, oiling, steaming, you begin to realize just how much infrastructure went into keeping this routine, well, routine. How Romans cleaned themselves without soap. You might assume bathing meant lathering with soap. It didn't. Soap was known but rarely used. Instead, Romans relied on strigils, curved metal scrapers, to clean their skin. The method was simple. Apply warm olive oil to the body, sit or recline in a warm room until pores open, scrape off the oil, sweat and accumulated dirt with a strigil, rinse with water or plunge into a cold bath. Servants often performed the scraping, especially for elites like Piso. It was a gentle but thorough process, practical, slightly ticklish, and oddly social. Sometimes scented oils were used, myrrh, cinnamon, even imported Indian nard. Some bathers brought their own. Others used communal supplies stored in amphorae labeled by scent and strength. There were even vendors stationed outside public bathhouses offering low-cost oil to the working class. Prices varied by season. Marble that remembers. While Piso reclines, he stares at the walls, smooth veined slabs of Cappadocian marble, cool to the touch and faintly damp. One of the walls features a relief of Hercules wringing water from a lion's hide. Another, Neptune and his retinue, emerging from the sea. These decorations weren't just aesthetic. They served as gentle reminders of strength, purification, and imperial power. But they also whispered the wealth of the man who owned the place. Each bathhouse, public or private, served as a kind of display case. Materials were imported from across the empire, marble from Numidia, tiles from Gaul, bronze piping from the east, mosaics commissioned from Athens, and it was all paid for in coin, favors, or grain. Piso's bathhouse wasn't just functional, it was political theater, quietly reinforcing his place in Rome's senatorial class. Running a bathhouse was a furnace slaves, called fornacarii, worked in shifts, stoking fires day and night to maintain temperature gradients in each room. Water boys, aquarii, managed reservoirs, tanks, and water levels, often drawing from cisterns or private aqueduct taps. Oil stewards kept stockpiles inventoried and guarded. Oil theft was surprisingly common. Maintenance laborers regularly patched tile work, cleared lime deposits from pipes, and re-mortared cracked ceilings. Piso likely had a bath steward, a trusted freedman tasked with managing it all. If something failed, if a pipe burst or the steam room cooled too quickly, it was not a minor inconvenience. It was a reputational risk. How much did cleanliness cost? Running the baths was expensive. Heating alone consumed firewood at scale. Estimates suggest a mid-sized bathhouse might burn several cartloads of timber per week. Olive oil, too, came at a premium, especially in winter. This meant bathing was a luxury. Even public baths, which charged low entry fees, or none if sponsored, had operating costs covered by wealthy patrons, emperors, or municipalities eager to court favor. For a senator like Piso, the bathhouse was both personal indulgence and public statement. I can afford to waste heat, water, and oil daily. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to influence. And yet, people got lost all the time. Even as Piso reaches for a warm towel and gestures for a fresh flask of oil, you wonder, how could someone of such power and wealth still lose track of something so intimate as his own bathroom? The answer may lie in the architecture. Baths were designed not for linear movement, but for experience. The transitions between heat and cold, dryness and humidity, silence and conversation were meant to disorient,
to soften the edges of public life. The spatial blur wasn't a flaw, it was the point. So as Piso prepares to move from the door to the frigidarium hisses softly on its bronze hinges. You step inside and feel it immediately, the drop in temperature. The warm, perfumed fog of the caldarium gives way to cooler, sharper air. The echo of dripping water, the hushed murmurs of other bathers, and the occasional slap of damp feet on tile fill the space. Senator Piso, now scraped, oiled, and thoroughly steamed, steps gingerly into the chilled water basin, teeth clenched, not from shame, but from the shock. And somewhere behind him, a towel slave waits patiently, holding a dry cloth and pretending not to smile. This is where the ritual ends and the informal business begins. What was the frigidarium, really? On paper, the frigidarium was the final stage, a cooling-off pool to close the pores and cap the cycle of heat therapy. But socially, it was far more important. In Rome, the cold bath was where people lingered. It was quieter than the tepidarium, less steamy than the caldarium, and less chaotic than the outer changing rooms. Here, business was discussed in hushed tones. Votes were casually traded, proposals floated, grievances aired. All while partially submerged in water that numbed the body but sharpened the tongue. It wasn't quite a boardroom, but it wasn't not one either. Piso knew this. He took his place slowly, eased into conversation cautiously, and tried very hard not to shiver while speaking. Politics, but in a towel. There are records, plenty of them, of deals being brokered in bathhouses. The jurist Ulpian once remarked that a man's opinions are best softened by warm water and the company of equals. Letters between Roman elites sometimes refer to bathhouse chats as minor sessions of the Senate. Important men wore little. Their guards waited outside, their voices carried. Privacy was thin, but familiarity ran deep. Bathhouse alliances were a quiet extension of Roman politics, not formal, but firm. And sometimes, the man who shared your oil or loaned you a strigil might support your proposal in the curia the next day. So when Piso makes an offhand remark about a tax bill and another senator chuckles from across the water, they both know a vote has just moved, silently, from one side to another. What happens after the bath? Drying off was an art form. Servants rubbed. The exit of a Roman bathhouse was rarely direct. Many complexes were laid out in loops or spirals. Some forced bathers to walk back through warming rooms to avoid temperature shock. Others guided them toward gardens or libraries or even small shrines for post-bath reflection. The point wasn't speed, it was pacing. And so Piso, already bathed, fed, and dressed, finds himself once again in a mosaic-lined hallway that does not quite lead where he thought it would. A marble bust of Minerva stares at him blankly. A servant politely coughs. "Ah," Piso mutters. "Again." He doubles back. What do we learn from a man who could conquer provinces, but not his plumbing? It would be easy to laugh at a Roman senator who got lost in his own bathhouse, But the truth is more comforting. Even in the heart of empire, even among marble and mosaics and whispered politics, people wandered. People forgot which corridor led where. People left with the wrong sandals. People said too much in the frigidarium. People slipped, slid, paused, and retraced their steps. The bathhouse was a space of ritual and repetition, but also of benign confusion. It was one of the few places in Rome where even the powerful were allowed to relax into a kind of dignified disorientation. Piso wasn't alone in his wandering. He was human in it. So as you close your eyes and picture the last plumes of steam curling above the tiled domes, the quiet ripple of cold water in the marble basin, and a slightly damp senator squinting at yet another wrong turn, you might wonder, did the Romans build their bathhouses not only to cleanse, but to offer a rare and quiet permission to simply not know where you're going?
Not warriors, not priests, but paper pushers. When most people think of the Aztecs, they picture warriors in feathered headdresses, priests holding obsidian knives, or farmers knee-deep in the chinampas, those floating garden plots that fed the empire. But nestled somewhere between all this ritual and warfare sat a different kind of figure, the kalpixke. The kalpixke, pronounced kalpishke, were tribute collectors, and more than that, they were bureaucrats, men tasked with keeping the empire running, one calculated load of maize, cocoa beans, or cotton cloth at a time. They had one of the most boring and critical jobs in the empire, and they were constantly watched. What did the Aztec Empire actually run on? You might be surprised to learn that the Aztecs didn't use coins. Their economy worked on barter, tribute, and tightly managed redistribution. Local towns sent goods, tribute, to the capital city of Tenochtitlan. The empire didn't just want some of everything, it wanted the right amount, delivered at the right time from the right people. This included bales of cotton, cocoa beans, used in barter and drinking, chilies, maize, and amaranth grain, feather bundles sorted by color and size, fine cloaks, tilmatli, graded by thread count, pots of salt, dried fish, jade ornaments, rubber balls, and more. It was the kalpixke's job to receive and record these things, to know how much came in, how much was stored, and how much needed to be sent elsewhere. The warehouse that fed an empire. You might picture these administrators in tall, feathered hats. In truth, they were probably tired men with ink-stained fingers and mental inventories of every sack of dried beans in the province. Tenochtitlan had entire storage complexes dedicated to tribute. Warehouses called lacamalacatl ringed the city. Inside, shelves stacked with clay pots, textiles folded by region, and ledgers marked with pictograms, Aztec hieroglyphs for counting and categorizing. Some scribes even used knotted cords, similar to the quipu used in the Andes. Others relied on pictorial codices, folded books filled with illustrations showing who gave what, when, and in what condition. These weren't decorative documents, they were working tools, used to track everything from dried fish deliveries to feather quality, and it was deadly serious. You might think miscounting a jar of honey sounds like a minor offense. It wasn't. The kalpixke were expected to be precise. Tribute was sacred. It was owed not just to the emperor, but to the gods. A late shipment or suspiciously light bundle could be interpreted as rebellion or incompetence.
So what did a day look like?
Let's imagine. You wake before dawn in the cool air of a storage district on the outskirts of Tenochtitlan. You enter a narrow office built of adobe and wood,
shaded by woven mats. A scribe hands you yesterday's record. You double-check tallies. Soon porters arrive, sweating, dust-covered, bearing tribute from a nearby town. They unload their goods. You inspect. Are the cloaks properly folded? Are the cocoa beans whole or broken? Is the maize dry? Are the feathers sorted by color? You sign off with a pictograph that means verified. You place a mark in a clay tablet. You notify the warehouse chief. You drink chocolate. It's bitter. Your fingers are already stained with carbon ink. And all the while you are thinking, is this cocoa shipment light, or am I just tired? And as the sun rises over the towers of Tenochtitlan, and you hear the faint sound of a conch shell blowing near the temple precinct, you might ask yourself, did the Aztec Empire truly rest on warriors and gods, or on the quiet strength of men who counted cloth in the dark? By mid-morning in Tenochtitlan, the sun glints off the canals, and the warehouses are already humming with controlled chaos. Somewhere behind the temple district, a weary Kalpichki, tribute overseer, sips cooled atole from a gourd cup and stares down at a freshly delivered pictograph scroll. Another shipment has arrived from a tribute town in the southeast. It contains bundles of dyed cotton cloaks, carefully tied with fiber string. But something is off. There are too many red cloaks and not enough blue. It's not a crime, yet, but it's a problem. One that requires not force or soldiers, but patient, careful, deeply boring paperwork. Because while the Aztec military might have built the empire, it was administrative competence that kept it from cracking apart. The Codex Mendoza and the feather problem. The most famous record of Aztec tribute, the Codex Mendoza, lists in exquisite, hand-drawn detail the payments owed by various provinces. It's filled with images, rows of sandals, jars of honey, weapon bundles, bird feathers, jade discs, and textiles, all illustrated in a calm, repetitive grid. This wasn't a document for historians. It was a manual, a working log of expectations. Some towns owned hundreds of cloaks every 80 days. Others were responsible for specialized goods, obsidian blades, dried insects, colored feathers, or greenstone beads. If a village failed to meet its quota, if the wrong color was delivered, or a fabric was of inferior weave, it was recorded, reported, and responded to. And yet, within this rigid framework, the Aztec system.
Let's say a town was scheduled to deliver 20 bundles of cacao beans, 40 feathered cloaks, blue, long-sleeved, 100 pairs of sandals, 2 jade discs the size of a man's hand. This would be recorded not in words but in pictures, stylized beans, tiny sandal images, dots indicating numbers, and a recognizable glyph for the town itself. The Kalpixke overseeing this wouldn't read the document, he'd interpret it visually. Training in this method often started early, and many tribute officials were literate in pictographs, but not necessarily speech-based literacy. In modern terms, it was like running a country on infographics. Back in the storeroom, our unnamed bureaucrat lays out the bundle of cloaks. First, he inspects the weave. Are they the hippie style requested, or did the province send a cheaper variant? Second, the dyes. Are they achote-based red and indigo blue, or have they cut corners with cheaper earth pigments? Third, the size. Each should be approximately 2 arm lengths square. Anything smaller is fraud. He makes notes, not on paper, but on a thin wood panel covered with chalk-like marks
Once confirmed, the numbers will be copied into a codex scroll stored in the temple library or central warehouse archives. Every confirmed delivery is marked not only on paper, but on the person's record. The town gains or loses favor. What happens if you get it wrong? This is where it gets tense. If you, the Kalpixke, record too generously, you're accused of favoritism. If you report too harshly, you invite rebellion. If you lose track of records, or misplace a feather bundle, or forget to log a delivery, you're called before your superiors, often priests or noble administrators. Some bureaucrats kept detailed personal ledgers. Others relied on memory, which, according to Spanish chroniclers, was honed to startling precision. A well-trained Aztec tribute official could recite dozens of regional tax schedules from memory, including exceptions for seasonal drought, warfare, or local famine. But when memory fails, reassignment or silence. There is no glorious monument to the forgotten Kalpixke, just gaps in the codices. Why did anyone do this? Status. Avoiding military conscription. The occasional feathered cloak of your own and, perhaps most importantly, survival. Being a bureaucrat, so as you drift in the scent of old paper, red clay, and ink made from burned cactus thorns, you may ask, was the true strength of the Aztec Empire hidden not in pyramids or warriors, but in the calm hands of the man who knew exactly how many sandals were due by sunrise? The tribute is sorted. The cloaks have been refolded, the feather bundles retired, the cocoa beans are sealed into large clay vessels marked with a dot and feather pictograph meaning approved. Our Kalpixki, whose name, like so many, has not survived in the record, leans against the cool adobe wall of the storage house and exhales. Another shipment was received, another line updated, another day without punishment, suspicion, or the quiet vanishing that befalls an administrator who miscalculates. But the rhythm of Aztec bureaucracy is more than just today's counts. Behind the scene, there is a larger logic to this paperless empire. A system held together not by charisma or conquest, but by deeply structured boredom. And soon, it would all be tested. When Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, he found not just gold and temples, but what his scribes called great books of paper, long folding screen codices filled with symbols that neither he nor his priests could interpret. The Spanish destroyed many of them. To them, these records looked like witchcraft or heresy. But what they were destroying wasn't religion. It was administration. Maps, taxes, town ledgers, diplomatic histories, birth and death records. The destruction of codices was the destruction of memory. The filing cabinets of an empire went up in smoke, and the quiet, tireless men who ran it all, some were killed, others were repurposed. The bureaucrats adapted, sort of. Here's the strange twist. The Spanish didn't understand the old Aztec tribute system, but they saw its value. Within years of conquest, they began to rely on surviving scribes and tribute officials to help extract taxes from indigenous towns. They kept the pictographic scrolls. then slowly began copying them into Latin script. Some Aztec scribes were trained to write in Spanish. Others worked in secret, preserving old methods in private. One famous example, the Codex Osuna, 1565, created by Nahua scribes to protest unfair treatment by Spanish encomenderos. It combined European and indigenous forms, proof that the bureaucracy, though cracked, hadn't vanished. Some calpichique simply became notaries under a...
Some codices were hidden in church basements. Others are buried. A few survived only as fragments, folded into the margins of legal petitions. And the men who once knew the tax obligations of 50 towns by heart, they slowly disappeared into the silence of colonial archives. But their work still echoes today. Historians study what remains. Codices like the Mendoza, Osuna, and Matricula de Tributos allow us to reconstruct not just the empire's military feats, but its paperwork. We know the names of obscure villages because someone wrote them down. We know how many feathers were collected from a province in 1483 because a Calpixqui recorded it precisely and passed it on. That's the strange power of administration. It endures quietly, not in song, not in myth, but in lists. So as the last lamp in the storeroom is extinguished and the warehouse gates are closed for the evening, imagine our unnamed official walking home along the edge of Lake Texcoco. His feet are dusty. His tunic is stained with ink and oil. No one cheers. No one records his name. But the empire worked because he did. And as your eyes begin to close and the soft sound of reed pens on parchment fades into the night, you might wonder, when we write history, do we overlook the people who wrote it first, quietly, in pictographs, in perfect, boring, necessary order? Somewhere in a damp stone monastery in 12th century Burgundy, a monk is frowning at a barrel of cheese. It's the third one he's examined this morning. The rind on this one is blooming faster than expected. The last one cracked during salting. The first smelled faintly of wild garlic, which is either a miracle or a mistake. He sighs and reaches for his wax tablet. This is Brother Theobald, and for 37 years, he has managed the Abbey's cheese cellar with an intensity typically reserved for scripture, because in this monastery, located miles from the nearest market town, cheese isn't just a food, it's storage, diplomacy, medicine, and an unusually complex spiritual metaphor. Why did monasteries make so much cheese? During the Middle Ages, European monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were the industrial farms, hospitals, and supply depots of their age. Monks needed self-sufficiency, especially in remote regions. Cheese solved several problems at once. It preserved excess milk. It fed guests and pilgrims. It could be stored through winter. It could be sold or traded for salt, parchment, and wine.
He measured humidity with strips of parchment that curled with moisture. He gauged fermentation by smell, poke, and taste. He recorded observations with wax styluses, then copied long-term trends onto vellum scrolls stored in a wooden cabinet between the kitchen and the scriptorium. Each cheese was labeled with a simple glyph, a spiral for goat's milk, a crosshatch for sheep, a star for cow. Wheels were rotated weekly, cracks were logged, visitors were discouraged from sniffing. His notes included phrases like batch 12A, began sweating abnormally after warm Lent. Batch 17B, rind split, suspect over-salted curds. Batch 23C, left near chimney too long, mild smoky flavor. Fryer insists it was intentional. The cheese wasn't just food, it was economics. By the 1100s, some monasteries exported their cheeses to nearby cities. Markets in Dijon, Lyon, and even Paris came to know certain abbeys for their wheels. Trade networks were built on them. Cheese was also a form of rent. Local peasants sometimes paid dues in dairy. A peasant might owe 2 wheels per quarter, carefully aged and delivered in linen. These wheels went straight to Theobald. And when the bishop's steward visited, it was cheese, not gold, that was placed before him, with fresh bread and a respectful nod. Monks debated cheese like theologians. There are records, serious ones, of monks debating whether cheese should be eaten on fasting days. Answer depends on the abbey. If animal rennet violated vegetarian rules, some said yes, others no. Whether stronger cheeses encouraged gluttony, one abbot thought so and banned a particularly pungent recipe. Theobald likely had opinions on all of this, but his records suggest he leaned on the side of moderation. Good cheese was to be respected, eaten slowly, shared generously, and most of all, never wasted. So, as Brother Theobald scribbles another note into his log, gently turns a soft-rinded round to avoid slumping, and murmurs a brief prayer for bacterial balance, you might pause to wonder how many tiny empires were sustained not by kings or knights, but by a quiet man in a robe, watching cheese in the dark. The morning fog has burned off the hills of Burgundy, and the abbey is filled with the sound of bees and quiet shuffling. Brother Theobald makes his way down the stone steps into the cool sanctuary of the cheese. Today, Theobald must prepare the pilgrim shelf. At least a dozen guests are expected by week's end. Penitent travelers heading toward Cluny or Vézelay, and the abbey, bound by custom and courtesy, must provide hospitality. This doesn't just mean bread and broth. It means cheese, and not just any cheese, but a selection both nourishing and digestible. Too firm, and the elderly will struggle. Too soft, and it won't travel well. Theobald selects 5 wheels. Each is carefully marked with a charcoal glyph. 2 from a March batch of sheep's milk, firm and slightly nutty, and 3 from the mild cow's milk wheels began just after Easter. He notes that one smells slightly sourer than expected, not spoiled, but evolving. He puts this on a wax tablet before heading to the scullery to speak with Brother Udo, who will portion them later this afternoon. What might feel like domestic tedium was in fact a careful system. Medieval monasteries functioned like tiny republics, producing everything from ale to ink, and every monk had a role in keeping the machine turning. Theobald's world was made of curd and time. He understood the subtle shift between spring milk and autumn's creamier yield. He knew which cellar walls sweated in humid months and which batches preferred the upper racks. Yet the spiritual life was never far from view. Monks were trained to see patterns and symbols in all things, including dairy,
In Theobald's records, he occasionally adds reflections that drift from practical to metaphorical. In one corner of his cheese log, beneath a list of rotating duties, he scribbled, "Curd is like the soul. Too much salt and it hardens, too little and it rots." These weren't idle words. For many monastic thinkers, the cheese wheel served as a microcosm of balance and patience, creation by stages, decay held at bay, imperfection quietly corrected over time. Even mold, that ancient enemy of preservation, was reconsidered. Theobald once argued during a mealtime reading that certain molds, when watched, scraped, and turned, improved the body, and perhaps also the heart. Visitors often laughed at the seriousness with which some abbots discussed dairy, but the truth was simpler. When you spent your life cultivating something slow and perishable, you began to see the divine in the waiting. One visiting bishop allegedly said, "This abbey smells like penance and cheese," and meant it as a compliment. Still, all was not calm. Spoilage was a constant threat. Storms could raise cellar moisture. Mice chewed into early batches. Salt delivery.
Monastic cheeses were often used in diplomacy, sent to other abbots, neighboring nobles, or even visiting bishops. In Theobald's time, a single, well-aged wheel could represent weeks of effort. Choosing which to give and when became a delicate art. Too ripe, and it might offend. Too young, and it might suggest thoughtlessness. So Theobald kept a short list of gift wheels, batches set aside for ceremonial use. He watched them daily. He knew their progress better than the seasons. As he returns to the cellar before Vespers, he rechecks the shelf and makes a final note about the souring batch. "Let it rest," he writes, in small practiced Latin, "and taste again after 3 days. May the Lord preserve it." He closes the wax tablet and extinguishes the candle. As the stone door swings shut behind him, a question lingers in the cool dark. Did the monks see holiness in the cheese because it lasted longer than words, or because, like prayer, it required quiet repetition to take shape? The wind rustles over the monastery roof, lifting the scent of hay from the cloister gardens. Inside, the scriptorium is still. Candlelight flickers over sheepskin parchment as Brother Theobald bends over a scroll, not to copy scripture, but to revise a cheese inventory. The scroll is long, carefully inked, and structured in quiet columns. On the left, dates and batch numbers. On the right, notes on condition, smell, firmness, rind behavior, and mold coloration. Tucked between the lines are marginalia, a cracked wheel that recovered after salting, a sheep's milk batch affected by bellflower pollen, a note of praise for a mild April brie-like style that surprised everyone at table. He's worked on this record for decades. Not every monk was allowed access to it. This wasn't just inventory, it was continuity, a dairy history of the abbey, passed hand to hand like a liturgical manuscript. Few would have called Theobald a scholar. He was not known for fiery sermons or deep theological disputation, but he was the first to notice that wheels cured too close to the garden wall took on the scent of time. He recorded the effect of barley straw matting versus rush. He understood, with quiet precision, how fermentation changed across seasons. As the years passed, monks came and went. Abbots were replaced. The bell rang for prayers. Wars happened far away. But Theobald's scroll grew steadily longer.
its pages filled with invisible labor, patience, salt, rot, and timing. And then, centuries later, fragments of that document were found folded inside a monastery's cookbook. Historians puzzled at the detail. Why so much care for dairy? Why this fixation on temperature, rind texture, or smell? But for Theobald, it had always made sense. The cellar was not a distraction from holiness. It was its own form of liturgy. Each cheese, a quiet act of discipline. A lesson in control and surrender, in knowing when to act and when to let nature shape things. As winter settled in and the cellar grew cold, his wheels continued to ripen in the dark, silent, ordinary, necessary. And so, as you drift further into stillness, with the imagined scent of aged rind and straw beneath your nose, you might ask yourself, is the most lasting work the kind no one notices until centuries later, tucked into the margins of a scroll, behind a door, in the cool breath of a cellar where someone once cared enough to turn a wheel every 7th day?
In the city of Isfahan, in the year 1079, the sun glinted off domes of turquoise, and the tiled walls of observatories shimmered in the midday heat. At the edge of one of these towers, quietly overshadowed by poets, mathematicians, and holy men, sat a man named Omar Khayyam. You may know him as a poet, but this isn't a story about poetry. It's about something far duller and perhaps more important: the length of a year. Khayyam had been hired, perhaps reluctantly, to solve a deeply administrative problem. The Persian court was having trouble with their calendar. Festivals were drifting. Tax collection was out of sync with harvests. The New Year celebration Nowruz was arriving early by solar standards. This was not a trivial matter. In a world where celestial cycles determined agriculture, worship, and royal ceremony, drifting days could lead to famine, spiritual misalignment, and bureaucratic headache. So the Sultan, Jalal ad-Din Malik Shah, commissioned a reform. He wanted precision, and to get that precision, he called in scholars, mathematicians, and astronomers, including Khayyam, to sit in observatories, track the stars, and decide once and for all how long a year really was. What followed was an experiment in celestial patience, and, in a strange twist, it became one of the most accurate calendar systems ever created. So accurate, in fact, that it quietly outperformed the Gregorian calendar by a few seconds, and was eventually forgotten. Why did the calendar drift in the first place? Calendars, as you may know, are attempts to flatten the chaos of the cosmos into neat boxes on parchment. The Islamic calendar was lunar, 12 months of 29 or 30 days.
but 12 lunar months make only about 354 days. The solar year, the time it takes the Earth to orbit the Sun, is about 365.24 days. That difference adds up fast. Persian society, with its pre-Islamic Zoroastrian roots, had long relied on solar observation. The old Zoroastrian calendar had been reasonably close.
Through years of observation, Khayyam and his colleagues calculated the length of the solar year with astonishing accuracy, roughly 365.2424 days. The modern Gregorian calendar, introduced centuries later, uses 365.2425. Khayyam was off by just a fraction of a second. But mathematics alone wasn't enough. The new calendar needed to work. It needed leap years, mechanisms to compensate for the drift. So Khayyam designed a leap year system that inserted an extra day every 4 years, except on certain cycles. It was complex, but it worked. And in 1079, the new Jalali calendar was implemented. A calendar that refused to budge. What made the Jalali calendar extraordinary wasn't just its accuracy. It was its silence. It worked so well, most people didn't notice it working. The Nowruz festival stabilized. Seasons aligned with planting and harvest. Religious observances resumed their natural flow. For a brief moment, time itself obeyed a man with a wax tablet and a shadow stick. Khayyam returned to his poetry. The court praised the calendar, but didn't celebrate its math. There were no festivals for orbital precision, just the quiet satisfaction of not needing to adjust anything next year. So as the stars wheeled above the minarets of Isfahan and the date rolled forward with subtle, satisfying precision, you might wonder, is it possible to change the world by doing something so perfectly that no one notices it's changed at all? The observatory had gone quiet. Some years after the Jalali calendar was implemented, Omar Khayyam returned to a quieter life. He taught mathematics, wrote philosophical treatises, and composed the verses that would one day, ironically, make him famous in the West for wine and romantic fatalism. But if he ever reread the calendar treatise he'd helped shape, he didn't linger on it. His job had been done. The stars had been measured, the equinox secured, and the paperwork of the heavens filed in proper order. Yet the calendar he helped engineer kept ticking on, quietly elegant, far outliving his moment of fame. It needed no urgent reforms. It did not embarrass kings, it did not demand spectacle, it simply worked. The Jalali calendar's leap year system, unlike the Julian's brute force every 4th year, required careful calculation. It used a 33-year cycle, inserting 8 leap years at uneven intervals. This produced a year length accurate to within 1 day every 5,000 years, more precise than the Gregorian reform that would follow 5 centuries later. But such brilliance had its cost, when calendars become political. After Khayyam's time, Persia saw dynasties rise and fall, Seljuks, Mongols, Timurid.
Omar Khayyam, by the time of his death in 1131, had become a poet to the public and a mathematician to a select few. The Jalali calendar, his most precise and administrative achievement, was never formally named after him. Nor was it commemorated in monument or ceremony, but in ways invisible to the crowds, his measurement of the year, so minute, so stubbornly correct, remained embedded in Persian bureaucratic life. Over time, the calendar quietly entered Persian royal courts and civil systems. In some regions, it became the default for tax collection, record-keeping, and agricultural planning. Its rules were copied and recopied by astronomers,
sometimes credited, sometimes not. Later Islamic scholars referred obliquely to a calendar more exact than a Christian's, but only in passing. While European calendars required adjustments every few centuries, Khayyam's barely drifted. There was no fanfare about this, no poetic celebration, just the quiet ticking of a system that refused to fall out of step with the sky. Why we forgot the calendar that worked best. You might expect that the most accurate solar calendar of the pre-modern world would be remembered with reverence, that it would be celebrated in science, taught in schools, or at least footnoted in the great timelines of astronomy. But Khayyam's calendar, like many quiet successes in history, was overshadowed by more dramatic, imperfect systems. The Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582, succeeded not because of math, but because of muscle. Papal decrees, European colonization, and printing presses ensured its dominance. Even today, it lags slightly behind the solar year, off by about 1 day every 3,300 years. Khayyam's calendar, in contrast, drifts only 1 day every 5,000 years. But Khayyam lacked the mechanism to force the world to use his math. He had accuracy without empire, precision without propaganda. And so, the better system was quietly archived, copied in dusty ledgers, used by bureaucrats, whispered about by astronomers, and then simply continued. Omar Khayyam once said, "Be happy for this moment. This moment is your life." Most people read that as a meditation on fleeting joy. But for a man who counted stars for decades, who traced the long arc of solstices across vellum, it might just as easily have meant something else. That the moment is measurable, and that it matters when you measure it right. Not because someone will reward you, not because the world will cheer, but because time deserves care, and order, once created, holds longer than applause. So as you settle deeper into rest, with thoughts drifting like clouds across a night sky traced centuries ago, ask yourself, how many of our days are still secretly guided by a man who spent his life counting shadows and wrote it all down, not to be famous, but simply to be correct? By the time the sun rose over Constantinople in the spring of 847 CE, ships had already begun docking at the harbors along the Golden Horn. Scribes stood ready with tally boards. Bales of goods were hauled onto the stone quays, and, as usual, a small mountain of salt barrels arrived from the Black Sea and beyond. Among the more glamorous imports, silks from the East, spices from Egypt, even slaves from the steppes, salt held no real mystique. It didn't sparkle, didn't perfume the air, didn't hint at exotic tales. But in the offices of imperial logistics, it was discussed more often than nearly anything else. Salt was the invisible skeleton of the Byzantine Empire. Without it, armies couldn't march, taxes couldn't be preserved, and the fish trade, crucial to urban food supply, would collapse. Somewhere, deep within the great palace, a weary official began his morning not by praying or reading, but by reviewing a record titled "Brined Goods, Received, Accounted, and Allocated, Year of Our Lord 6349,
That's 847 CE by modern reckoning. Salt as infrastructure. It's easy to forget that before refrigeration, food didn't last long on its own. Meat spoiled, vegetables wilted. Even grains, when damp, could go sour. But salt, whether as a dry rub, a brine, or a preserving agent in pickling, could stretch the life of almost any edible. For the Byzantines, who managed not only a capital city of perhaps 500,000 people, but also military garrisons stretched across 3 continents, this wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Salt was used to cure fish, especially mackerel and anchovies, which were abundant in the Aegean and Black Sea. Preserve meats for military rations. Harden cheese wheels for long transport. Pack vegetables for winter. Tan leather. Create medical salves, even pay wages. Yes, the old salary comes from salt thing has roots here too. And so, from distant Anatolian salt pans to narrow alleys in the Constantinople markets, salt was bought, tracked, taxed, stolen, smuggled, weighed, and argued over constantly. The Salt Bureau. At the peak of its administrative complexity, the Byzantine state maintained a unit known to modern historians as the salinatores, salt administrators. They operated under the larger tax and provisioning network of the Praetorian Prefecture, responsible for gathering resources across provinces. Salt producers were taxed in kind. That meant a portion of the salt.
One letter from a governor in Asia Minor complained that 2/3 of the harvest salt was taken by the imperial agent before drying was complete. Another letter responded tersely, "This is proper. Loss from sun is loss to emperor." Even monks got involved. Some monastic communities produced salt to fund their libraries or soup kitchens. Others protested salt taxes as too burdensome, and more than one abbot got in trouble for smuggling brined fish under false weight. Salt and the city. In Constantinople, salt took on a more mundane but vital role. Fishmongers used it daily. So did tavern owners, bathhouse attendants, and vinegar brewers. Nearly every foodstuff in the city passed through salt at some point. There were even preserved items the empire was known for: pickled grape leaves, salt-cured mullet, sour cherries in brine. And with each trade, a small tax was collected. A ledger found centuries later in a monastery archive records, in almost poetic monotony, 17 jars lentil pickled, 3 casks turnips in vinegar, 1 cask spoiled, tax collected, seller fined. A world measured in casks and spoons, quiet, dull, essential. So as the imperial dock official lifts his quill once more, squints at a shipment from Sinope, and murmurs something about improper sealing wax, you might begin to see the empire a little differently. Was it really cataphracts and mosaics that made Byzantium endure? Or the careful tracking of brine-soaked goods by a clerk no one remembers? The road to Adrianople was slick with mud and salt dust, not because anyone had intentionally salted the path. This wasn't winter maintenance, but because thousands of barrels rolled down it every month, leaking gently from ill-sealed seams. Fish oil, brine, and slush mingled with the dirt. By the time a caravan of oxen reached the city gates, its scent arrived a full mile ahead. It was a smell that said, in essence, the empire is functioning. For the Byzantine state, salt wasn't just about internal preservation.
It became an instrument of external influence. Some historians half-jokingly call it. In practice, the empire used its control of salt-preserved fish to build trade partnerships, negotiate treaties, and maintain relationships with distant allies and suspicious neighbors. In the 10th century, during a particularly tense season with the Bulgarians, Byzantine envoys didn't just carry scrolls and coins, they brought preserved food. Brined mullet and cured mackerel were prized among Slavic chieftains who otherwise relied on freshwater catch and smoked meat. These gifts weren't showy, but they traveled well, lasted through winter.
If Constantinople could ship salted fish across mountains in spring, it probably had its borders in order. Salted food became a symbol of imperial competence. There's even evidence that tax exemptions were offered to certain fishermen in the Pontic region in exchange for their goods being earmarked for foreign tribute. One particularly chatty 11th century logbook, now partially damaged, notes, 27 barrels, excellent catch, tightly sealed, dispatched to Cherson for diplomatic exchange. One leaked, noted, clerk reprimanded. The details may be dull, but they illustrate something vital. Empires run on predictability. Salt gave Byzantium a rare edge. It made food portable, tax revenue storable, and loyalty taste better. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. In the year 927, the salt pans of Nicomedia flooded during a rainy spring. The brine didn't evaporate properly, and the resulting harvest was a fraction of normal yield. The panic in the capital was immediate, not because they feared starvation, but because the ledgers would not balance. Suddenly, preserved fish stocks dipped. Rations for frontier garrisons had to be halved. The Imperial Navy complained of spoiled barrels. A delay in shipments caused tension with a Balkan ally, and taverns in Constantinople charged nearly double for pickled cabbage and salt-cured eel. For a brief moment, something deeply boring, the rate of evaporation in an inland salt flat, had geopolitical consequences. To compensate, salt shipments were redirected from Cyprus and Syria, incurring extra costs and delays. Bureaucrats haggled over which provinces could afford to donate their reserves. The Great Palace convened a temporary salt advisory committee. And by autumn, the crisis quietly resolved. No war, no famine, just a handful of irritated monks who had to eat fresh fish instead of salted for Lent. Salt routes and salt robbers. Where there's value, there are thieves. Though not romanticized like gold caravans or silk trains, salt wagons were a tempting target, especially in the rural roads of Thrace and inland Anatolia. Bandits often targeted the carts not for the fish inside, but for the brine itself, which could be resold to tanners and brewers. The imperial response was predictably bureaucratic. Permits. Only designated routes could be used for salt shipments. Guards were posted at key depots. Salt crates were marked with inked sigils to identify imperial property. One preserved administrative notice reads, "If cask is found bearing the seal of Galata, and it be opened before record is made, the offender shall pay 3 solidi and spend 4 days in cold storage." Cold storage likely meant a punishment cell, not refrigerated, though one wonders if that irony was intended. Despite the risks, the flow of brine continued. Caravans moved slowly, predictably, tirelessly. Their reward? A city fed, an empire held together. So as you picture the weary mule drivers plodding through salted mud, their cargo sloshing faintly with every jolt of the cart, you might wonder how many global empires have stood or stumbled, not over swords or ideas, but because they ran out of salt in a rainy spring. Centuries passed and the great empire began to shrink. Borders eroded, garrisons fell quiet, and marble was chipped away from once grand forums. But even in the empire's twilight, deep in the vaults of Constantinople's sprawling bureaucracy, one room remained oddly well maintained. It was not the treasury nor the armory. It was the Imperial Provisioning Archive,
a dry, stone-walled chamber stacked with bundles of reed paper and parchment, where clerks in aging robes recorded the most humdrum of truths: how much salt had been received, taxed, spoiled, and spent. One such scribe, named Andronikos, left behind a note in the margin of a salted goods account dated 1327. Inventory exceeds expectation. Many fish uneaten. The emperor has not visited the palace in some weeks. Still we record, because the fish wait, even if no one eats them. By that time, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a threadbare patchwork. The walls of Constantinople were still imposing, but beyond them stretched a crumbling network of tribute states and receding influence. Yet the salt records, like their odor, lingered. Monasteries still pickled vegetables. Soldiers on the last frontiers still received cured meat. Officials, even under siege, still tallied salt barrels, down to the drop. Salt and the siege. In the final decades before the empire's fall, the siege of Constantinople became almost a ritual. Threats from Latins, from Bulgarians, and eventually, of course, from the Ottomans. But one of the great unnoticed questions was not when the city would fall, but whether the pickled food supply could keep up. In 1422, as Ottoman pressure mounted, surviving records indicate that salt inventories were still being managed with surprising formality. One warehouse clerk, tasked with rationing supplies during a blockade, compiled a chart of preserved vegetables, listing the number of days each cask would last based on population. His note reads, "If consumption reduced to fast day portions, pickled leeks may last until August. The monk in charge of barrel 3 claims spoilage. This is unverified." During the final siege in 1453, food was scarce, but even then, salt-preserved goods offered just enough sustenance for defenders to last until the city finally fell. When the walls were breached and Mehmed II entered the salt's quiet afterlife.
After the conquest, the Ottomans adopted many Byzantine practices: architecture, administration, even elements of urban provisioning. Salt remained vital in Istanbul's markets, carried over on the backs of donkeys, and listed in tax records for centuries more. But the original Salt Bureau, with its dry ledgers and rules about mule permits, slowly disappeared. The scribes were gone, the barrels changed shape, and the old scrolls written in fading Greek were stuffed into monastery walls or burned with the rest of the bureaucracy. Yet, some things endured. In modern Greek cuisine, in pickled grape leaves and cured mullet, in the faintly vinegared tang of a market cart in Thessaloniki, you might still taste echoes of that system. And deep in an archive in Mount Athos, a brittle page survives. Barrel 112, intact. Fish firm, brine level steady, marked for Lent. That one barrel, never opened, still noted. So as you drift toward sleep with a strange comfort in knowing that even empires can be held together by things as simple as salt and a clerk's inked tally, you might ask yourself, what stories of endurance are hidden in the ledgers we never read? The ones that smell faintly of vinegar, brine, and stubborn, delicious preservation. Early one morning in the spring of 1281, in the small French village of Souvigny, the local baker opened his shutters and found a quiet crowd already gathering. The market square was still shaded in mist. Chickens wandered between cobbles, but the villagers were frowning. Not at him, but at his empty bread carts. "There's no flour,"
he said simply, holding up his hands. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. They already knew. Word had traveled faster than the smell of rising dough. The watermill upstream had stopped turning. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a small-scale economic emergency. For medieval Europe, flour was everything. Bread was not a side dish, it was the staple of daily survival. And behind every crusty, round, and chewy loaf stood the figure rarely remembered in songs or sermons: the miller. A quiet monopoly on calories. In theory, millers were just tradesmen. They ground grain into flour using mills powered by water wheels or wind. In practice, they were deeply entangled in the life of every village because for much of the medieval period, peasants weren't allowed to grind their own grain at home. That right was reserved for the lord's mill, a service peasants were required to use for a fee, of course. Lords constructed mills on rivers, along streams, even in city boroughs. They then leased these to local millers, who collected a small portion of the flour, usually around 1/16th to 1/32nd of every sack, as their toll. These rules were known, if grimly accepted, but over time millers developed a reputation, quietly skimming more than their share, inflating tolls, or worse, mixing sand or ground beans into flour to stretch it further. In some towns, millers were considered only slightly more trustworthy than moneylenders, and yet none of that stopped them from becoming quietly indispensable. Flour, feast, and fast. Flour's significance wasn't just culinary, it was political, especially during Lent, when meat and dairy were forbidden. Bread consumption surged. In monasteries, entire calendars were adjusted to reflect fasting needs. In cities, church officials worked with guilds to ensure enough bread would be available even at subsidized prices. So what happened when the flour ran out? It was a miller, not a knight or a bishop, who usually stood in the way of catastrophe. In London during the 13th century, the city kept detailed ledgers of flour usage, especially near holidays. A surviving parchment lists 3 barrels oat flour, ground coarse, for fast day wafers. 2 barrels missing, miller blamed. Reprimanded, but no fine, wheel frozen by frost. Miller records were also kept in rural France, Germany, and Italy. Often, they include both fines for short-weight flour and complaints from bakers about irregular grind quality. The problem wasn't usually malice. It was simply physics. If the water was too low, the wheel wouldn't turn. If it froze, operations stopped. If the millstones cracked, replacement could take weeks. That meant, quite literally, no flour and no bread. Millers as gatekeepers. So while their work may seem mechanical, even dull, the truth is that millers were power brokers of a different sort. They weren't feasting in castles or preaching from pulpits. They were leaning over sacks of grain, listening to the pitch of the turning wheel, checking the coarseness of flour between their fingers, and sometimes, just sometimes, deciding not to pass it all along. In a small village, a miller might be the only person who knew how much wheat was actually being grown. In cities, they sometimes worked closely with grain merchants, setting quiet prices that could affect hundreds of loaves. And in times of scarcity, they could hold back
flour, not out of cruelty, but because they feared running out before the next delivery. It was dull, practical, uncelebrated labor. And yet, their influence was felt every time someone bit into a crusty roll or wondered why it was missing from the morning table. So tonight, as you drift into rest and the rhythm of a turning water wheel echoes somewhere far off in your imagination, you might quietly ask, how many of history's most important events depended not on kings or clergy, but on whether a millstone cracked during Lent? By the summer of 1304, the complaints in the village of Souvigny had shifted from empty bread carts to suspiciously light ones. The flour had returned, but not in full. People whispered that the local miller, a man named Etienne, had taken more than his share. Again, he was not alone. Across medieval Europe, using false measures, a scoop that looked larger than it was, failing to clean the stones, resulting in fouled flour. In one 1312 court record from Yorkshire, a miller named Hugh was fined for clandestinely retaining 1/8 portion above his due and falsely swearing upon the matter. And still he kept his job. Why? Because millers were hard to replace. It took skill to run a mill, especially a water-powered one. The flow had to be adjusted with wooden gates. The stones, upper and lower, had to be dressed periodically to maintain sharp edges. A bad miller could ruin a whole village's flour. A passable one, even if dishonest, was often tolerated out of necessity. And besides, everybody cheated, or at least that's how it was said. Bakers' quiet protest. Bakers, too, developed coping strategies. In some towns, bakers' guilds pushed for better regulation of local mills. In others, they took matters into their own ovens, adjusting recipes, combining bad flour with good, or relying on secret suppliers to bypass the official toll mill altogether. One London baker in 1340 noted in his account book, "Flour of the North Mill, coarse, bitter, took to blending with pea meal. Customers did not notice." When caught with poor flour, bakers often blamed millers. When caught baking illegal weights, bakers blamed the flour's dryness. Everyone had a reason. No one wanted to take the blame. And in the middle of this flour fog, millers quietly prospered. It wasn't all scandal and skimming, though. In many towns, the mill was also a central gathering point. Women brought sacks of grain, children waited in line, and men exchanged news while carts jostled for position. The rhythmic groan of the water wheel became part of the village soundscape. Millers sometimes kept benches for resting guests. They gossiped. They heard about harvest yields before the Lord's steward. They listened to complaints about taxes, weather, goats. They also heard secrets. More than one village dispute started or ended at the mill. One amusing 14th century case from Ghent tells of a miller who, after overhearing an affair while resetting his gears, shared it during confession, where it was overheard by another miller and then leaked back to the village via a fishmonger. Gossip moved like grain, quickly and with consequences. Leverage. In lean years, Millers could use their position to demand favors, sometimes literal. In border regions, some were accused of refusing to grind grain unless clients provided additional. So, as you picture the slow turning of the water wheel, the steady grind of stone on stone, and the quiet conversations drifting through the millhouse window, you might wonder, did medieval survival depend less on kings and battles, and more on whether Etienne decided to be honest that week? By the late 14th century, the role of the miller was as entrenched in the rural imagination as it was in the economy. He was the one figure who could make a harvest edible or ungrindable, and everyone had a story. The miller who added chalk to flour, the one who had a secret trapdoor for skimming extra sacks, the one who fell into his own mill pond during a feast day and floated past his own water wheel like a bloated saint. In truth, most millers were just trying to survive the same system as everyone else: harsh taxes, rigid customs, and a weather-dependent food supply. But the difference was that the miller stood precisely at the choke point between grain and bread was everything. So when the flour ran out, so did patience. The Flour Riot of 1392. It began in Dijon. A drought the year before had reduced the wheat harvest to nearly half its average. Bakers, desperate, raised prices. People grumbled. Then came whispers that the local millers were stockpiling flour to sell it later, at double the price. The riot was small by modern standards. A few carts overturned, a scribe's house set aflame. 2 millstones were pushed into the Ouche River, but it was enough to force the mayor to summon an emergency tribunal. Records from the tribunal show millers pleading their case. The water flow was insufficient. We ground by night. We took no more than custom allows. We kept flour in reserve for the poor, said another. It spoiled, that is all. Whether they lied or not didn't matter. The people believed the worst. For the rest of the year, guards were posted near the mills, and bakers were given permission to grind small amounts privately, an extraordinary exception. It wasn't the first time a flour riot happened, but it marked something new. The people, not the lords, were now watching the millers. Around this time, in the flatter, wind-swept regions of the Low Countries and southern England, another kind of mill began to appear. One that didn't need rivers or rain, the windmill. Unlike water mills, which were tied to specific streams and thus to specific landlords, windmills could be built almost anywhere. This broke the monopoly of the lord's water.
And while the introduction was slow and uneven, windmills were expensive to build and maintain, their mere existence changed the game. By 1450, parts of the Netherlands had more windmills than watermills. In England, some lords started taxing wind use in a failed attempt to control the spread. For the first time in centuries, bread supply began to slip out from under the millers' tightest grip. The millers who remained. Not all power was lost. In forested and mountainous regions, water mills remained the norm. There, millers adapted. Some became more transparent, posting their toll rates on carved boards. Others built reputations on fairness, often enforced by the local church, which had a vested interest in fasting bread being abundant and bland. But the fear of the corrupt miller never entirely faded. In Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 1300s, the miller's tale depicts a lecherous, deceitful braggart, a perfect distillation of how the public viewed millers after centuries of bad flour and quiet extortion. Even today, the English word miller carries a faint echo of flour sacks and small dishonesty. A barrel of bread and a question of control. By the end of the Middle Ages, millers no longer held the same iron grip on local economies. Trade routes expanded, urban markets diversified. But for several centuries, the person standing between hunger and fullness was not a noble or a knight. It was a man in a flour-dusted tunic, listening for the pitch of the wheel and deciding, often quietly, how much to give. Their world was full of waits, water levels, and community complaints. They were rarely thanked, often resented. And yet through droughts, famines, plagues, and wars, bread appeared each morning, because someone, somewhere, had ground the grain. So tonight, as you picture the turning wheels slowing to a stop at dusk, and the miller brushing flour from his hands before shuttering the window, ask yourself, how many millions of loaves were eaten without anyone ever knowing whose hand ground the grain and whose hand held a little back? Imagine this. The Nile has just flooded, the black silt has settled, and across a narrow courtyard shaded by reeds, a scribe dips his reed pen into ink made of soot and water. He yawns, not because he's tired, but because today, like every day, he must write the same sentence again and again. 2 sacks barley, 1 goat, 1 jar honey, rendered to temple storehouse, verified. It's year 6 of Pharaoh Neferhotep I, which modern scholars place somewhere around 1740 BCE. Egypt is halfway through the Middle Kingdom, an era known for its tombs, engineering, and elaborate bureaucracy. And at the heart of that bureaucracy were the scribes, men trained not in war or farming, but in writing, mostly about goats. You may picture ancient Egyptian scribes as elegant scholars, heads bent reverently over holy texts. But most were not copying religious hymns or funerary spells. They were copying receipts, and lots of them. The cult of the clerical. In a world without spreadsheets, scribes were the Excel formulas of ancient Egypt. They were educated in institutions called houses of life, where they practiced copying symbols onto worn-out sherds of pottery, ostraca, or cheap scraps of limestone. They memorized sign after sign, reeds, birds, baskets, stools, snakes, falcons, and fish, each with multiple meanings depending on placement. And once their training was complete, many were dispatched not to palaces, but to warehouses, ports, and barns, anywhere taxes were collected in kind. Egyptian taxes were paid not in coins, those wouldn't arrive until the Greeks, but in grain, oil, animals, labor hours, and occasionally dried fish. Everything was counted, and everything counted had to be written down. So a good scribe didn't just need legible handwriting, he needed to know weights, seasonal calendars, local dialects, tax law, and crucially, when not to ask too many questions. 1 goat, 4 copies. Let's say you delivered a goat to the local tax station. That single goat, if properly entered into the records, would generate at least 4 copies. 1 for the Central Temple Authority, 1 for the local nomarch, provincial governor, 1 for the delivery archive, kept in case of disputes, 1 for the scribe's own log, which he often annotated in red ink with notes like excessively smelly or owner disputed age. This meant that a single day's taxes from a modest village could result in hundreds of lines of text written by hand in cramped script, often while sitting cross-legged on a mat. Over time, this created an avalanche of documentation. Egyptologists have recovered entire archives from rubbish dumps, tens of thousands of entries listing everything from 1 jar date.
In elite literature, scribes were praised almost mythically. One famous instructional text, The Satire of the Trades, describes all other professions as dirty, dangerous, or demeaning, while the scribe is elevated to near divine status. Be a scribe. It spares you from carrying bricks, from smelling of fish, from bleeding as a soldier bleeds. But for the average government scribe, the job wasn't all poise and poetry. It was sore backs, long hours, and a diet heavy in bread and beans. It was worrying whether the inkstone would dry before you finished your copies. It was counting baskets, again, because someone moved them before they were tallied. Even their offices were often makeshift. One scroll mentions a scribe working beneath the shade of a basket tree near the temple latrine, because his usual spot was occupied by livestock. Still, they kept writing. So as you drift off, think not of golden sarcophagi or the sweeping columns of Karnak, but of a single scribe hunched beneath a reed mat, muttering to himself as he counts yet another jar of fermented date paste. And ask yourself, was the greatness of Egypt really built on pyramids? Or on the thousands of cramping hands that kept the ledgers legible, even when the ink dried? In a dusty storeroom just south of Kom Ombo, sometime in the 18th century BCE, a junior scribe named Ipu held a stylus between sore fingers and tried not to smudge his 10th copy of the week's grain receipts. His ink had gone dry. The air was hot enough to curl the papyrus sheets, and the clerk beside him kept sneezing into the basket of rolled scrolls labeled "Excess Lentils, Year 6, verified twice." Papyrus, once so abundant along the Nile's banks, had become harder to find that season. Floods had damaged the plants, and temple authorities were reluctant to waste precious sheets on what they called non-permanent tax notations. So instead, the junior scribes were told to write on old ostraca, broken bits of pottery that had already borne half-erased lists from years past. In one surviving fragment from Kom Ombo, you can still make out the overlapping entries. 2 sacks barley, temple reserve, scratched faintly beneath, 1 goat, unfit, returned to sender. It was bureaucracy over graffiti, layered, reused, reinterpreted. And in the midst of it all, scribes like Ipu pressed on. Bureaucracy in the sand. We tend to think of ancient Egypt in terms of monuments, massive, dramatic, eternal. But in reality, what made the state function wasn't stone. It was paperwork, and not just majestic inscriptions carved into granite, but the small, forgettable entries about fish baskets and cart repairs, written by tired men trying not to smudge ink in a breeze. The Nile flooded predictably each year. That meant crops came in cycles, and so did taxes. And each flood was followed by weeks of frantic measuring, counting, and writing. Granaries had to match receipts. Temple stores had to log their surpluses. And if grain went missing between field and warehouse, someone had to answer for it. In Thebes, a preserved report records a case of suspected grain fraud. A scribe notes, discrepancy found. Field 28 yielded 17 sacks, but only 12 recorded at storehouse. Suspect, porter called Menemhat, said to be feeding his goat. It might sound petty, but such discrepancies added up. Grain wasn't just food. It was salary, sacrifice, and storage. And the only way to keep track of it was to document every ear of wheat, every jar of lentils, every goat claimed as unfit for delivery. Scribal drama and minor scandals. Not all scribes were saints. Some altered entries either to protect friends or, more rarely, to embezzle goods. A few took bribes to fudge tallies. Others were simply lazy. One scroll from the reign of Amenemhat III contains a furious note scrawled in the margin. This list is nonsense. The sheep are named twice, the fish are counted as hens, and the signature is a blob. Repeat the work or be removed. And yet, most scribes did their job, diligently day after day, through heat, sandstorms, and the occasional outbreak of hoof and mouth disease. There are even reports of scribal apprenticeships gone wrong, where ambitious youths copied the wrong column from an older tax list, leading to years of erroneous temple accounts. Punishments ranged from public reprimands to, occasionally, loss of access to fresh ink, a surprisingly effective penalty. The myth of the noble scribe. First, as the Middle Kingdom gave way to the New Kingdom, the scribes kept writing. By now, entire scribal dynasties had emerged. Sons followed fathers into the profession. Ink recipes were passed down like secret sauces. A prized reed pen might be used for decades and buried with its owner in a clay jar, alongside a faded scrap of a receipt for goat hides. In Thebes, archaeologists found just such a grave, belonging to a man named Thutmoses, who served in the royal storehouse for nearly 40 years. His tomb inscriptions weren't heroic, but practical. They praised him for neat handwriting, consistent grain tallies, and never once duplicating an inventory roll. It may sound dull, but in a society as carefully measured as Egypt's, this kind of consistency was more valuable than heroism. You could lose a battle and recover, but lose track of your barley rations for a season, and people starved. Paper empires. By the time of Rameses II, Egypt's scribal system had grown enormous. Temples, palaces, and even army units all had their own scribes. Some wrote in cursive hieratic script for speed. Others stuck to the older, more formal hieroglyphs for public monuments. But make no mistake, most writing wasn't done in stone. It was done on fragile papyrus, inked with carbon black, and stored in wooden boxes lined with linen or tucked behind clay jars in storerooms. And the sheer volume was staggering. In the ancient workers' village of Deir el-Medina, where tomb builders lived, a trash dump revealed over 10,000 ostraka. Most weren't poems or prayers. They were receipts, lists of bread rations, schedules for temple offerings, notes like delivered, 3 baskets figs, 1 sack barley, 1 loaf spoiled, replaced next day. One scribe even doodled cats on the back of a tax notice, suggesting even the ancient world's most diligent record keepers got bored sometimes. The first civil servants. Modern governments rely on bureaucracies, departments, paperwork, interoffice memos, but ancient Egypt was one of the first to institutionalize that idea. They didn't just govern by decree, they governed by ledger. Every corner of the kingdom, from the quarries of Aswan to the ports of Memphis, had scribes logging goods, people, animals, and offerings. Even the afterlife wasn't exempt. Tomb inscriptions instructed the dead to declare before the gods, "I did not steal. I did not falsify the grain measure. I did not cheat the scribe. To live well
and be remembered well meant respecting the system. It may not sound romantic, but it was astonishingly effective. For over 2,000 years, Egypt remained remarkably stable. And a major reason for that was the ink-stained men hunched over tables, counting baskets and jars so no one else had to guess. Scribal afterlife. When Egypt's dynasties faded and later empires arrived, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the scribes adapted. Some learned Greek, others kept their old scripts alive in temples. By the time papyrus scrolls made their way to Alexandria's libraries, their origins were still etched in the work of those anonymous clerks who once documented goat deliveries by moonlight. And though the scrolls have mostly crumbled to dust, the image remains. A reed pen scratching on soft papyrus, a dry hand reaching for another sheet, and the distant bleating of a goat whose only crime was being taxable. So tonight, as the world quiets and your thoughts drift towards sleep, think of all the forgotten scribes who ensured that Egypt didn't starve, didn't forget, didn't collapse, not because of strength or splendor, but because every grain, fish, and sandal was carefully, patiently recorded. And ask yourself, did the immortality of Egypt depend on its monuments or on its margins? Somewhere in the Forbidden City, beneath the rustling shade of lacquered wood beams and beyond the reach of court musicians, a eunuch in soft-soled slippers moved silently down a corridor with a scroll in his hands. Not a proclamation, not a poem, but a delivery schedule detailing which tribute horses had arrived from Yunnan and whether they were carrying lice. It was year 3 of the Yongle Emperor's reign, circa 1405 CE, and the imperial communication network stretched farther than ever before. Trade had opened, tribute had grown, and someone had to log every last shipment, letter, and grain count. That someone was often a eunuch. In the grand sweep of Chinese history, eunuchs are usually remembered as whisperers behind the throne, schemers, spies, or tragic victims of palace intrigue. But for centuries, many of them were administrators, paper pushers, and yes, mailroom managers. This is the story of how they quietly became the logistical backbone of the Ming court, from guardians to gatekeepers. Eunuchs, men castrated to serve the court, existed in imperial China for centuries. But during the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, their role expanded dramatically. No longer confined to guarding concubines or sweeping ceremonial halls, they began handling sensitive information. Why? Because they were trusted. Ironically, their lack of family ties and heirs made them appear less corruptible. They couldn't build dynasties. They weren't linked to the Confucian scholar class. So emperors, especially those suspicious of the bureaucracy, relied on eunuchs to bypass the regular administration. The emperor's orders, copied, carried, and sealed by eunuchs. Reports from governors, routed through eunuch-managed archives. Inventory of royal gifts, cross-checked by eunuchs in the Internal Service Office. They weren't just minor clerks. They were the hinges on which the doors of imperial communication quietly turned. Sealed scrolls and stiff fingers. The Ming court produced an enormous quantity of correspondence. Most documents were written on fine mulberry paper or silk, depending on rank and urgency. A single edict might require a dozen hand-copied duplicates.
each sealed with red wax and strung with cords, then delivered by fast rider or barge. Each stage had a record. Each copy had to be logged. And who did the logging? Eunuchs. They worked in shifts, copying characters by candlelight, dipping soft brushes into black ink, and tying bundles of correspondence with braided cords. Some eunuchs specialized in foreign reports, others in tax audits. A few were even trained to read coded messages sent between governors in restive provinces. This wasn't glamorous work, but it was critical. In fact, in some cases, an error in delivery routing could delay a food shipment by weeks. A miscopied weight total could disrupt rice distribution to thousands of soldiers. And when the emperor asked why something hadn't arrived, well, it was usually the eunuch's fault. The silence of the second courtyard. It's easy to romanticize the forbidden city, the sweeping roofs, the marble staircases, the golden tiles glowing at dusk. But behind the palace theater, in the shaded second courtyards, it was often very quiet. This is where eunuch scribes worked, away from the high drama of court politics. You'd find them at small desks, hunched over registers, recording who had delivered what and when. Some rooms were filled with ink scrolls dating back 40 years, tied neatly with silk thread. Others stored only unfinished drafts, awaiting imperial signatures. You might hear only the soft rustle of sleeves or the occasional sigh as a character was smudged and had to be rewritten. Few of these eunuchs were famous, but many served for decades, utterly invisible, yet holding the empire's nervous system in their hands. So as you picture the paper lanterns swaying in a breeze just outside the record room window, and the patient scratching of ink across silk paper, you might wonder, was the Ming dynasty held together by military might or by a handful of tired men with very good handwriting? By the mid-15th century, the halls of the inner court's document vault were overflowing. Scrolls were stacked shoulder-high in lacquered cabinets, indexed by reign title, region, and, when remembered, by category. A single mistake in labeling might send a eunuch clerk searching for hours through boxes marked Miscellaneous Regional Affairs, Northern, for a letter that was technically Emergency Ration Schedules, Southern. The records were multiplying faster than anyone could sort them. And yet, each day, the eunuchs came with inkstones, dry fingers, and a stiff sense of duty. They tied silk cords, dusted shelf tags, and tried to make sense of a bureaucratic ecosystem that had become too large for its own scrolls. When paper becomes power. The eunuch-run Eastern Depot, originally created to handle the emperor's confidential correspondence, slowly became one of the most powerful institutions in China. While the Grand Secretariat controlled policy on paper, the Eastern Depot controlled the paper itself, especially anything marked by imperial hand. That meant if a governor's report never reached the emperor, it wasn't because the governor didn't write it. It was because the eunuchs didn't file it. Or perhaps they did file it, just somewhere a little harder to find. This quiet control over access to communication gave eunuchs a strange kind of soft power. They didn't command armies. They didn't rule provinces. But they could delay a decision, edit a report, or fail to notify the court about a regional flood until it was too late to respond. Over time, This gave rise to rumors of corruption. Some governors began sending 2 copies of reports, one to the official bureaucrats, another directly to their eunuch contacts, often with small gifts tucked between the folds of the scrolls. These gifts were rarely bribes in the usual sense. More often, they were fine brushes, delicate inks, or northern pears packed in salt. A small way of saying, please make sure this gets read. When ink smells like rice. The daily rhythm of the mailroom began at dawn. Eunuchs assigned to transcription duties would unroll scrolls, gently weigh the corners down with bronze coins, and begin the long process of copying imperial correspondence by hand. Some letters were a single line. The winter wheat from Anhui is delayed. Check the embankments. Others were longer. Regional governors might send pages of updates about roads, tax yields, or bandits. Every character mattered, and so did every smudge. The ink, mixed fresh each morning, often smelled faintly of rice paste, soot, and old water. Brushes were cleaned between copies, and the eunuchs developed calluses not just on fingers, but on the insides of their wrists, from the constant pressure against low writing desks. They kept spools of red string nearby for binding documents once dry. In especially humid months, scrolls were dusted with fine sand to prevent mildew. And when the monsoon rains came, clerks wrapped the most valuable letters in oilcloth, sometimes tucked into ceramic tubes for protection. The secret behind the imperial response time. The emperor's orders were rarely spontaneous. They were curated, carefully prepared by eunuch scribes who summarized reports, selected what the emperor saw, and suggested forms of reply. An emperor might appear all-knowing, commenting on a distant official's poor grain storage, but only because the eunuch had quietly circled the problem in red ink 3 days earlier. When the Yongle Emperor planned his famous maritime expeditions, led by Admiral Zheng He, the preparations took years and thousands of written orders. Many of these never left the palace. They were requests for rope, wax seals, provisions, ink, and translators. Guess who wrote and routed them? The eunuchs of the internal mailroom. And when tribute ships returned with spices, elephants, or exotic horses, it was again the eunuchs who recorded every crate, counted the gifts, filed thank you notes, and sometimes translated them from Persian, Tamil, or Arabic into court-approved classical Chinese. But what about mistakes? Of course, not every scroll made it to the right desk. Some were lost, some were misfiled. One letter from the northern province of Shanxi, dated 1472, was finally opened in 1486, 14 years late. Its contents? Snow has blocked all roads. Please advise, should the spring planting be delayed? The eunuchs filed it anyway, quietly, with a small note. Received too late for reply. Stored for completeness. That phrase, stored for completeness, appears again and again in the archival remnants of Ming bureaucracy, not because someone would read these documents, but because someone might one day want to say they existed. So as you picture rows of paper scrolls tied in red string, stacked neatly beside a half-finished inkstone, and a single eunuch brushing dust from a misfiled tribute report, ask yourself, did the Ming Empire succeed because of strategy? Or because one underpaid palace scribe kept everything, even the rice shipment complaints, on file? The final years of the Ming dynasty were not kind to paperwork. As famine swept the countryside and rebel forces crept closer to Beijing, the palace mailroom, the once immaculate domain of red string bundles and ink-slicked brushes, began to falter. Some scrolls arrived late, others didn't arrive at all. The steady rhythm of record-keeping that had defined the Ming court for over 2 centuries slipped into silence, smothered by uncertainty. Still, the eunuchs kept writing. In the summer of 1643, with rebel activity circling the capital, a eunuch named Gao Yu made what might be one of the last complete tribute entries in the palace registry. His entry, discovered centuries later, read simply, 33 bolts of mulberry silk, pale green, sent from Suzhou, delivered to Hall of Supreme Harmony. No defects, seal intact. There were no flourishes, no signs of panic. Just a final line in a system built on quiet repetition. The ink dries first. By this time, most of the empire's traditional systems were under strain. The Grand Secretariat had been decimated by court purges. Regional governors were acting with increasing autonomy. But the eunuch scribes, loyal not to power but to procedure, still filed entries. They filed reports about food shortfalls, about falling morale in outposts, about the emperor's requests for medicinal herbs. In a time of political collapse, these documents were not designed to change anything. They were meant to be there, a paper trail through the twilight. Even as rebel leader Li Zicheng breached the walls of Beijing in 1644, palace eunuchs were still tying scrolls, sealing wax stamps, and logging lost inventory. Some historians believe that a handful of eunuchs died trying to protect the archives, not out of loyalty to the emperor, but out of sheer compulsive duty. One legend tells of a eunuch named Junda who attempted to burn a warehouse of unfinished scrolls rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Whether true or not, it speaks to a quiet ethos that had governed their work for centuries. If it wasn't recorded, it never happened. A career with no fame, no heirs, no endnotes. Eunuch scribes rarely left behind families. Most left no tomb inscriptions, no heirs to carve praises in stone. Their legacy was the record itself, the daily flood of measured characters, so predictable and so essential that no one ever stopped to thank them. But without their ink, there would be no Chinese imperial history as we know it. It's easy to remember the generals, the rebels, the emperors in robes. But behind each of those stories were quietly bound bundles of reports. Horse counts, salt prices, tax collections, earthquake notices, and census rolls, all carried by eunuchs with steady hands and unswerving focus. In fact, many of the Ming dynasty's surviving records were preserved not in palatial libraries, but in backroom cabinets organized by these scribes. The empire fades. The ledgers remain. After the Ming fell, the new Qing dynasty reviewed the palace records, some with suspicion, others with astonishment. They found centuries of careful documentation, dates of celestial observations, tally sheets for palace repairs, even memos about missing teacups. One Qing official wrote, "Though they had no sons and no titles, their diligence built a wall of paper around the dragon throne. And in that wall, some of the last whispers of a fading world survived." Today, when historians piece together the structure of Ming society, its food supply, climate shifts, temple finances, or bureaucratic reforms, they rely not on royal proclamations, but on the repetitive, unloved, indispensable records created by eunuch scribes. Even in collapse, the empire wrote everything down. So as your mind drifts towards sleep, picture the soft glow of an oil lamp in a forgotten corridor of the Forbidden City, where one last eunuch sits with ink-stained fingers, smoothing a wrinkled scroll and tying it shut for no one in particular. And ask yourself, when history ends, is it the battle that's remembered, or the person who remembered to write it down? It's still dark outside. You've been asleep for a few hours, or trying to be, when a faint sound stirs the monastery, the creaking of a wooden door, the scraping of sandals on stone, and then a bell. Not a dramatic, resounding chime, but a dry, almost apologetic clang that echoes down the cloister halls. It's time for matins, the first prayer of the day. And for Brother Alric in 12th century Normandy, that means dragging himself out of his straw-filled mattress and making his way to the cold, candle-lit chapel to chant psalms until sunrise. But how did he or anyone know it was time? In an age without alarm clocks, digital watches, or even reliable sundials during winter, medieval monks had to get creative. They didn't just measure time. They listened for it, sniffed it, and in some cases, watched it melt. This is the quiet, meticulous story of how monastic communities kept track of hours, not for profit, labor, or war, but for prayer. By the 12th century, in abbeys from Yorkshire to Tuscany, monks had refined the fine art of counting hours without a single ticking gear. The goal was simple but deeply spiritual: to follow the divine office, the 8 daily prayer services, at the correct time, every single day. That meant someone, somewhere, had to know exactly when it was 3:45 a.m., whether the stars were visible or not. And so, across Europe, they turned to tools as clever as they were quiet. The candle as clock. The first, and perhaps most poetic solution, was the candle. Specially made time candles were cast to a consistent thickness and length, with markings incised into the wax every inch or so. In some monasteries, it was understood that one candle burned evenly for 4 hours. So if it was lit at matins and had reached the 3rd mark, you knew it was nearly time for lauds. Some abbots, in an effort to improve accuracy, embedded thin brass pins at key intervals. As the wax melted and the flame reached a pin, it would drop with a tiny ping onto a metal tray below. That soft metallic clink was enough to wake the bell ringer in the adjacent cell, who would then shuffle off to the chapel to sound the next call to prayer. But candles were imperfect. Wax could melt faster in summer or slower in a breeze. A rainy night might dampen the wick, throwing the whole schedule off by half an hour, which, for a Benedictine monk, was no small sin. So they added backup systems. The drip of water and the flow of hours enter the clepsydra, or water clock. Adopted from ancient Greek and Roman traditions and used widely in Islamic scientific culture, the water clock was a bowl with a tiny hole in the bottom, placed inside another bowl to catch the drips.
Monasteries used them in dark or enclosed spaces where sunlight couldn't reach, and candles weren't ideal. As water slowly dripped from one container to another, it measured time with reasonable regularity. Some even floated a small piece of wood in the bowl to indicate water level as a visual time marker. One chronicler from the Abbey of Cluny wrote, "In the dead hours, when the fog denies the stars and the wax will not hold, the drip of the basin tells us when to rise." Of course, the system wasn't flawless. Water clocks froze in winter and overflowed in summer, but combined with candle clocks and celestial observation, they offered a redundancy monks grew to depend on: the bell ringer's burden. Behind every tolling bell was a very tired monk. The position of campanarius, bell ringer, wasn't glamorous. It meant light sleep, awkward naps, and the responsibility of waking dozens of brothers without waking the entire village. Many monasteries had rotating shifts, where young novices were assigned a week of bell duty, called nocturnum servitium. In practice, this meant sleeping in a cold room near the chapel, waking at intervals to check the candle or water level, and striking a series of bells according to which service was due. Matins, sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. Lauds, around dawn. Prime, first light. And so on through terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The bells weren't rung all at once either. The first peal was a warning, the second was the actual call, and the third, in some stricter monasteries, was a punishment for those not already in their stalls. The bell was both alarm clock and moral reminder. When stars fail and wind lies. Of course, many monasteries relied heavily on astronomy, the position of certain constellations, the color of the sky at a particular hour. These were all signals for the time-conscious monk. But this method had its problems. What if clouds covered the stars? What if snow buried the sundial? In one humorous and probably exasperated margin note from a 13th century English manuscript, a scribe complains, "The bell was rung too late by half an hour. Brother Thomas claimed the moon lied." And so, faced with nature's inconsistencies, monastic communities layered method upon method, building a kind of analog redundancy system using candles, stars, sand glasses, and drip bowls, all cross-checked by sleepy novices. So next time you glance at your phone's clock and see the time to the second, spare a thought for Brother Alric, whose midnight relied on melting wax, dripping water, and the soft clang of a brass pin hitting a tray. And ask yourself, was their time slower? Or were they just better at listening for it? By the 14th century, European monastic communities had become quiet marvels of timekeeping. They couldn't measure the second nor predict the minute, but they knew exactly when to chant, when to eat, when to kneel, and when to fall into bed, exhausted and serene. In a world that often relied on vague rhythms, after sunrise, before the cock crows, once the dew dries, monks had invented something shockingly modern: structured time, not for commerce, not for science, but for the soul. And it was all built on tools that burned, dripped, faded, and failed. A clock without gears. There was no single machine running these monasteries. Time came from things that vanished, wax candles that dissolved into puddles,
oil lamps that flickered and died, water bowls that slowly emptied. Monks lived by rhythms that were meant to disappear, meant to return them to stillness. And in this slow-motion world, keeping time wasn't just about ringing a bell. It was about listening for the changes in nature, the hush between prayers, and the sigh of the night breeze rustling the chapel door. In one preserved rule from the Abbey of St. Gall, the bell ringer was instructed to strike a soft tone thrice with humility, to avoid startling the older monks awake too harshly during matins. Even waking people up was a gentle art. And then came the clocks. In the 14th century, mechanical clocks began to appear, first in Italy, then in France, and slowly spreading north. They were massive things, driven by weights and escapements, often installed in town halls rather than monasteries. But their arrival marked a change in how time was understood. Monks had once counted hours as intervals between sacred acts. Now, for the first time, time began to exist as a thing that ticked outside the human body. Some abbeys installed clocks in their towers. Others resisted. At Cluny, where prayers once followed the drip of oil lamps, an early clock was mounted with 2 iron hammers that struck every hour. It thrilled visitors and annoyed the brothers who had grown used to silence. In one letter, an abbot grumbles that the clock strikes like a drunkard, not knowing the tone of matins from the song of roosters. But gradually, even monks gave in. Mechanical time was louder, sharper, easier to measure. It demanded less human attention. And slowly, the quiet rituals of wax and water faded. Time once whispered. There is something haunting in the knowledge that, for centuries, a man's spiritual life was ruled not by ticking hands, but by dripping bowls, melting candles, and the weight of quiet obligation. Brother Ulrich, if he ever lived, never owned a timepiece. But he may have lit the matins candle hundreds of times, watched it pool beneath the brass pins, and heard the faint clink that told him to rise, wrap his robe, and step into the frozen chapel while the rest of the world slept on. He measured his life not in years, but in bells. He counted time not to control it, but to honor it. And for the rest of us, for whom time often feels rushed, sliced, monetized, it's oddly comforting to remember a world in which the pace was governed by silence and flame. So as you fall asleep tonight, imagine a monastery window, fogged over with the breath of winter, and a single brass bell gently tolling 3 times. And ask yourself, when did we stop listening to time and start chasing it instead? In the dry hush of ancient Persia, long before diesel trucks rumbled through Iran's desert highways, caravans made their slow, deliberate journeys across the arid plateaus, loaded with dates, textiles, turquoise, and sometimes even snow. Not for trade, but for cooling the Shah's sherbet. These caravans and the camels who bore the brunt of the burden needed rest. But there were no roadside inns, no petrol stations, only gardens, not blooming flower beds for pleasure, but precisely engineered spaces for shade, stillness, and recovery. This is the story of how Persian gardeners, through a mix of hydrology, geometry, and quiet generosity, invented rest stops in the desert and made sure even the camels had somewhere cool to sit down When you think of a camel stop, you probably don't imagine symmetry. But Persian caravanserais, those walled garden compounds spread across trade routes, were built with the kind of precision more often reserved for palaces or temples. Why? Because rest in the desert was a science, and one that included not just food and water, but airflow, tree spacing, and the sun's slow arc across the sky. At the center of it all was the Persian gardener, not just a planter of seeds, but a master of climate engineering. The role of the bag. The bag, a walled garden, usually quadrilateral and centered on a pool, was a Persian invention going back to at least the Achaemenid Empire, 6th century BCE. These gardens weren't just decorative. They were microclimates, with raised beds, irrigation channels, qanats, and trees layered in height like a cooling forest. They could lower the surrounding temperature by several degrees. Caravanserais adopted this model for function, not fashion. They built shade systems. A camel arriving at noon in a desert bag might be guided through a series of shaded arcades before being tethered beside a tamarisk or date palm. The trees were chosen for their leaf structure, their drought tolerance, and their very specific angle of shade. Too much sun and the animals dehydrated. Too little and the mud brick walls stayed damp, inviting mold. The balance had to be perfect. Qanats, underground rivers without a sound. Water was never obvious. In Persia, it flowed underground. Qanats, sloped, hand-dug tunnels, carried snowmelt from distant mountains into the heart of these gardens. They fed stone basins, trickled into marble channels, and kept the roots of shade trees damp year-round. More importantly, the water cooled the air. Garden designers placed small canals beside walkways and walls. As the hot wind passed over the water's surface, it dropped in temperature. Combined with shade from thick walls and tall trees, it made the space feel inhabitable, even in 45 degrees Celsius heat. Some caravan gardens even included shallow pools, large enough for camels to kneel beside, though most were for evaporation, not drinking. And all of this, hidden, quiet, effortless to the eye. Wind catchers and the art of slow breeze. If you looked up, you might notice a curious structure, part tower, part vent, perched atop the courtyard's walls. These were badgers or wind catchers, early air conditioning systems. They didn't use fans, just gravity. Wind catchers were designed to trap even the faintest desert breeze, channeling it down a vertical shaft where it passed over water and cooled before entering the main space below. In camel courtyards, these breezes made a measurable difference. Bellies stayed cooler, tempers stayed calmer. Some badgers were angled to catch northerly winds in summer. Others rotated seasonally. In Yazd, a city famous for its heat, travelers still sit beneath centuries-old wind catchers and feel the breeze whisper through bricks laid by men long forgotten. Why design for camels at all? Because trade required them, and camels, like humans, needed recovery time. Merchants could afford to stretch out on a mat, sip a cool drink, and recite poetry in the shade. But their camels had just crossed 100 kilometers with packs of indigo dye and bundles of silk. They needed shade, silence, and in many cases, veterinary attention. Persian garden stops weren't centered
sentimental. They were logistical compassion, designed not for beauty, but for function, hydration, and calm. Even the placement of the latrines mattered, built downwind, shielded by tamarisks, and away from the resting bays, so no odors or flies would disturb the beast's rest. So as you imagine a soft breeze curling through a clay arcade, the slosh of water hidden beneath the paving stones, and the deep, indifferent sigh of a camel lying down in the shade for the first time in days, ask yourself, did the Persian garden bloom for its flowers, or for the animals who couldn't ask for shade, but needed it all the same? By the 16th century, the height of the Safavid era, Persia's trade routes had become veins of wealth and poetry, not just for merchants, but for the engineers who knew how to keep those merchants and their animals alive in 100-degree heat. It wasn't an empire of roads. It was an empire of rest stops. But as caravans got faster, and later, as trucks replaced beasts and highways replaced footpaths, many of the baghs and caravanserai gardens faded into silence. They didn't crumble from war. They disappeared because no one needed to shade a camel anymore. And yet, the blueprints remain. The camel courtyard blueprint. In one surviving architectural record from the 15th century, the inner courtyard of a caravanserai is described with exact dimensions. Trees spaced every 4 cubits, about 6 feet, to maximize morning shade. Mud brick walls angled to reflect sound away from the animal bays. Wind catchers directed east for optimal summer capture. Basins no deeper than a handspan, so young camels wouldn't slip inside. Nothing was left to chance. Even the brick patterns on the walking paths were chosen to be smoother for padded camel feet, and slightly ridged where humans walked for better traction during water hauling. And then, of course, there were the troughs. Each one had a narrow lip on one side, not for aesthetic reasons, but because that made it easier for a camel to lower its head, drink deeply, and rise again without tipping the basin over. Hospitality as infrastructure. Hospitality in Persian culture was never just about tea and cushions. It was architectural. To host a stranger meant cooling a space before they arrived. It meant building walls thick enough to insulate against desert winds. It meant planting trees not for beauty, but for function. Trees that wouldn't drop bitter fruit, wouldn't attract too many birds, and wouldn't die from poor irrigation. One 14th century Persian manual advises caravanserai keepers to choose date palms over pomegranate, for the camel favors the broad shadow and does not nibble the bark. Shade wasn't just a convenience, it was etiquette. And that etiquette extended not just to merchants, but to their animals. Because to treat the beast with care was to respect the journey. When shade became asphalt. By the 20th century, the last camel-based caravans were dwindling. Roads of stone turned to roads of tar. Cars moved faster than wind, and the old bags fell out of use. Many were repurposed into museums. Others vanished beneath new cities. A few remain in places like Kashan, Yazd, and Isfahan, dry but intact, their channels empty, their wind catchers still rising like stone sails into the desert sky. But their principles, the deep, quiet logic of slowing heat,
channeling breeze and making room for a weary animal, still survive in Persian architecture, even in modern homes and courtyards. And even now, under the relentless sun of the Iranian plateau, a dusty palm might still throw its angled shadow across the ground just so, waiting for a traveler who will never arrive. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine a silent courtyard bathed in amber light, a single camel curled beneath a tamarisk, and the last breeze of dusk brushing the surface of a shallow basin. And ask yourself, what would cities look like today if we still designed them? For the tired traveler with no words, imagine this. The Nile has just flooded, the black silt has settled, and across a narrow courtyard shaded by reeds, a scribe dips his reed pen into ink made of soot and water. He yawns, not because he's tired, but because today, like every day, he must write the same sentence again and again. 2 sacks barley, 1 goat, 1 jar honey, rendered to temple storehouse, verified. It's year 6 of Pharaoh Neferhotep Shoi's, which modern scholars place somewhere around 1740 BCE. Egypt is halfway through the Middle Kingdom, an era known for its tombs, engineering, and elaborate bureaucracy. And at the heart of that bureaucracy were the scribes. Men trained not in war or farming, but in writing, mostly about goats. You may picture ancient Egyptian scribes as elegant scholars, heads bent reverently over holy texts. But most were not copying religious hymns or funerary spells. They were copying receipts, and lots of them. The cult of the clerical. In a world without spreadsheets, scribes were the Excel formulas of ancient Egypt. They were educated in institutions called houses of life, where they practiced copying symbols onto worn-out sherds of pottery, ostraca, or cheap scraps of limestone. They memorized sign after sign: reeds, birds, baskets, stools, snakes, falcons, and fish, each with multiple meanings depending on placement. And once their training was complete, many were dispatched not to palaces, but to warehouses, ports, and barns, anywhere taxes were collected in kind. Egyptian taxes were paid not in coins, those wouldn't arrive until the Greeks, but in grain, oil, animals, labor hours, and occasionally dried fish. Everything was counted, and everything counted had to be written down. So a good scribe didn't just need legible handwriting, he needed to know weights, seasonal calendars, local dialects, tax law, and, crucially, when not to ask too many questions. 1 goat, 4 copies. Let's say you delivered a goat to the local tax station. That single goat, if properly entered into the records, would generate at least 4 copies. 1 for the Central Temple Authority, 1 for the local nomarch, provincial governor, 1 for the delivery archive, kept in case of disputes, 1 for the scribe's own log, which he often annotated in red ink with notes like excessively smelly or owner disputed age. This meant that a single day's taxes from a modest village could result in hundreds of lines of text, written by hand in cramped script, often while sitting cross-legged on a mat. Over time, this created an avalanche of documentation. Egyptologists have recovered entire archives from rubbish dumps, tens of thousands of entries, listing everything from 1 jar date beer, sour, to 3 sandals, left foot only, worn by militia. This wasn't poetic, but it was civilization. The scribe's physical life. Being a scribe had its perks.
exemption from manual labor, relatively high status, and access to literate circles. But it also came with consequences. Medical papyri from the New Kingdom, a few centuries later, describe ailments suspiciously similar to writer's cramp. Aching fingers, stiff backs, dry eyes. One even includes a remedy for the hand that cramps. Warm in goat's milk, press with linen soaked in honey. Still, scribes endured, not just for Pharaoh, but for the machinery of agriculture, law, and ritual. A scribe's salary was often paid in kind: bread, beer, onions, and occasionally fine linen. More ambitious scribes could rise to become record keepers in temples, overseers of granaries, or managers of irrigation schemes. Some even became poets. But most, they wrote down who gave what, when, how much, and whether it was fit for store. And at the end of each month, they probably filed complaints about wrist pain and smudged ink. So tonight, as you close your eyes and imagine the rustle of papyrus and the soft scratch of reed pens, think of the man who spent 12 hours a day drawing tiny birds and jackals just to document a partial delivery of onions. And ask yourself, did the pyramid stand because pharaohs were powerful? Or because someone remembered how many baskets of lentils arrived each week?